They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms, but it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. Our hunt for cursed treasure begins not with diamonds and gold, but with skin and bone. Unearthed in the dangerous wilds of Russia's Arctic Yamal Peninsula. Upon this frozen landscape, more than 40,000 years ago, there roamed a majestic beast whose time on this earth was fast running out.
Allure is a female woolly mammoth calf who died 42,000 years ago in the frozen north wastes of Siberia.
Woolly mammoths are some of the most iconic extinct species. You can see them in so many museums. Everybody knows the image of this big hairy elephant, and that hair helped keep them warm because they lived in the Ice Age when the world was much cooler than today.
Woolly mammoths are cousins of modern-day elephants. They lived around 400,000 years ago, right up until a little after 4,000 years ago. Unfortunately, mammoths began to disappear because of a change in climate.
And if a change in climate wasn't bad news enough for the mammoths, a new, even greater danger was lurking.
A new type of super predator arrived in many of the areas where they lived, and that super predator was us, humans, Homo sapiens, our species. So we probably played a role in the extinction of not only the mammoths, but all the other big mammals that were alive at the time, but also died out. Saber-toothed tigers and giant woolly rhinoceroses and ground sloths and armadillos the size of cars and so many of these other Ice Age megafauna creatures.
The fossilized remains of all these lost Ice Age creatures can be seen in museums around the world. But unlike the majority of prehistoric creatures, what makes the mammoth special is just how much we have come to understand about what they looked like and how they lived. This knowledge, however, comes at a tragic cost. This is the remarkable tale of a discovery that almost never was, of a curse that was cast following a truly tragic end of one so young.
The Yamal Peninsula, that's part of Russia, part of Siberia, is really this finger of frozen land that pokes up into the Arctic Ocean. So it's a very, very cold and very snowy place.
Russian oil and gas companies now operate in this region, but the native people of this land are the Nenets, a nomadic tribe that have lived here for over 1,000 years.
In May 2007, a local Nenet reindeer herder called Yuri Kudi and his sons, they were searching for firewood along the river.
As the frost thawed on a muddy bank of the Uribe River that morning, Yuri spotted something unusual in the icy bank.
Humans have been encountering fossil bones and other fossils for millennia. Dinosaurs, mammoths, these kind of fossils, they're not new. And that has led, of course, to some feelings of fear. He realized right away what it was, but he was nervous about approaching it because Yuri and his people often feel that mammoths can bring a bad omen.
When Kudi and his sons found the mammoth in the permafrost, they were shocked by this discovery, but they immediately realized that it was something important.
And if so, it was hugely valuable, not just scientifically, but potentially financially.
The Nennet are a spiritual people, and like any culture, they carry their own superstitions about the world around them. And among these, passed down through the generations, is a very grave warning about one particular creature that is revered above all others.
So he kept his distance. He actually went to talk to a friend about it to decide what to do.
And so he set off on a 150-mile journey, and he turned up at a museum and described what he found. The director recognized that this was probably the remains of a baby mammoth, and he knew that was important.
When Yuri and the people from the museum returned, the mammoth was gone. It wasn't there anymore. And they figured out what happened. Somebody else who knew about the discovery collected it and traded it for some snowmobiles.
So the team went off to the nearest settlement, and sure enough, they spotted the little mammoth calf propped up outside a local store.
It had been gnawed by wild dogs. It was in a bit of a precarious state, so the museum had to step in and rescue it.
The mammoth was named Lyuba, after Yuri's wife, and transported safely to the Shimonoseki Museum in Salkehad.
Luba is one of the most important woolly mammoth fossils that's ever been found. This is a mummy. This is not just a skeleton, not just some bones, but there's hair, there's skin, there's muscles, there's internal organs. You can even see her last meal preserved in her stomach. Luba tells us so much about what mammoths look like, about how they reproduced and raised their young, and about how they actually lived during those later years of the Ice Age.
Lyuba is so well preserved that researchers have even been able to determine her cause of death and paint a tragic picture of the final moments of this poor cursed creature.
And what scientists found when they examined her body was that it had only been a month old when it died. There was mud trapped in her trunk, and that mud was the sort of mud which was associated with the bottoms of frozen lakes. What the scientists were able to determine was that she had been traveling, probably with her mother, across the frozen wastes and had stepped onto a frozen lake. But the ice had broken, and Lubia had essentially face-planted into the bottom of the lake. Here, she had inhaled the mud from the lake bottom.
The tiny 1-month-old calf had been claimed by the lake bed, but the mud that killed her also served to preserve her.
Luba was so beautifully preserved because, sadly, she got stuck in the mud and then frozen. And so those things basically made Luba into a time capsule that could survive to the present day. The story of Luba is a sad story in that she was a little baby mammoth that got trapped in a river and died. And then later, when she was found, she went through all kinds of trials and tribulations as far as being stolen and being gnawed by dogs and having to be recovered and helicoptered out. But I do think this story has a happy ending because Luba, as a fossil, tells us so much about what her extinct species was once like. Luba, in many ways, is something like a ghost that helps resurrect our understanding of these long extinct animals.
Luba represents one of the greatest ever discoveries of any Ice Age animal, and especially of mammoths, ever found in the world. Luba is part of the Shimonoseki Museum in the Arctic Circle, where she is today considered a national treasure.
For the thousands who flock to see her every year, Lyuba is a chilling reminder of a lost world that will continue to haunt us until the end of our own days on Earth. We now travel to the Netherlands, where a Dutch artist created a painting that has brought bad fortune from the moment his brush touched the canvas.
Vincent van Gogh was one of the most famous artists that ever lived, but tragically, he allegedly only sold one painting during his lifetime.
He's most famous, though, for having, unfortunately, committed suicide at the very young age of 37.
Vincent van Gogh's work is now among the most valuable in the world. However, sadly for Van Gogh, he wouldn't live long enough to reap the financial rewards of his talent. He died penniless and destitute.
He's well known for his very bright, colourful, very expressive works like sunflowers, or maybe the painting of his bedroom, or the Yellow House, which he painted in the 1880s.
But among the bright and vibrant images in the collection is an uncharacteristically somber painting, one with many cursed associations.
Congregation leaving the Reformed Church at Noonan is one of Vincent van Gogh's earliest paintings. He painted it in the town of Noonan. His father had actually become a pastor at that church in 1882, so he started to paint the work in 1884 as a gift to his mother, because his mother was lying in bed with a broken leg.
He'd been staying with his parents for the last year, and they'd been having a lot of problems with him being rather difficult and moody. Their relationship was not that great, and so in some ways he seems to have made this picture as almost like a peace offering.
The picture's interestingly not what we associate with Van Gogh. It doesn't have the bright colours, the thick paint. It's a very simple scene of a little church, and there's a little group of people outside the church at the front. There is a kind of gentle solemnity, I almost want to say sadness about it, which makes it quite haunting.
This haunting image is one with a tragic past, which has evolved over time from a celebration to a commemoration, and is now believed by some to be the carrier of a curse.
The picture was first painted in 1884, and it showed a man carrying a spade in the foreground, which you can't see anymore, because he reworked it.
Shortly after completing the painting, Van Gogh's father died, and the image began to take on a new, darker meaning for him.
He repaints it, he adds leaves to the trees, and instead of the peasant, you have a group of figures, one of whom is a woman right at the centre, very clearly dressed in mourning. She's in black, she seems to be wearing a veil. And it seems likely that this was done to personalise the picture in a way for his mother. Her husband, his father, had died a little earlier in March. So this is a kind of recognition that the painting now has an even more poignant aspect to it.
You know, Van Gogh is a famously tragic figure. The world knows the story of him cutting off his own ear and committing suicide. His whole reputation is that of a fabulously tortured artist, the age-old story of someone too sensitive to cope with the world. It was a very personal painting, a very personal record of his family's loss.
Charged with all of Van Gogh's distress from his bereavement, this important yet bleak work has hung in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam upon its opening in 1973. From the outset, it was displayed alongside and in contrast to much of his other work, which demonstrates the style for which he would later be famed.
Van Gogh also has the dubious honour of being one of the masters whose works are most stolen. Since 1975, 34 Van Gogh paintings have been stolen from museums and galleries around the world. That puts Vincent van Gogh pretty much at the top of the Stolen Artists League.
At 8 a.m. on the 7th of December 2002, the unthinkable but perhaps inevitable happened. Thieves gained access to the Van Gogh Museum, home to more than 200 original paintings by the great artist, and made a beeline for congregation leaving.
Congregation leaving was actually stolen by, as far as anybody's ever discovered, an opportunistic thief who looked at the building and thought that he could get in. He and an accomplice climbed onto the roof using a stolen ladder, then broke a window into the gallery, grabbed this painting and another small early seascape, stuffed them in the bag, and then dropped out of the gallery window on a rope and ran away with them.
Although they had made a clean getaway, what the thieves hadn't anticipated was that in stealing the paintings, they had unwittingly triggered a cascade of misfortune that closely followed the artwork for well over a decade.
Congregation leaving the Reformed Church had hung in the Amsterdam Museum for many, many years, and its theft caused an international police hunt, but it also caused some embarrassment for the museum when it was revealed that neither that painting nor the beach at Scheveningen had been insured.
The paintings weren't seen again for 14 years. Law enforcement agencies across the globe who policed organized crime drew a blank. The pieces were feared lost forever. But unknown to the authorities, the paintings were eventually going to find their own way home, and in the process bring down everybody involved in their theft, with ruinous consequences.
Octave Durham was a professional burglar with a long criminal record. But when he stole the paintings, it was an ill-thought-out job. He hadn't got any buyers lined up. What do you do with two extremely hot pieces of stolen artwork?
Durham did, however, against all the odds, eventually find someone to take them off his hands. But so began a series of ill-willed happenings.
He himself was quite religious, and I think he was slightly spooked by the picture and by the subject of the picture. And then he tried to sell it to two men who were murdered before he got a chance to complete the transaction.
After his first two customers were murdered, Durham had his revelation. I'm a religious man, I'm a superstitious man. These paintings are cursed. I want nothing more to do with them, is how he described it later.
However, he recovered and eventually sold it to this man, Imperiali, who ran a cafe in Amsterdam.
The cafe owner smuggled the congregation leaving the Reformed Church out of the city. Having acquired it for just a few $1,000s, he waited for things to cool down. A decade would pass. The picture, which remained too hot to handle, remained hidden from the world. That was until a seemingly unrelated event began to unfold halfway across Europe in Italy.
In 2016, the Italian police were investigating the leader of the Camorra drug ring in Naples.
Italian police were in the process of seizing assets worth more than $22 million, including villas, land, and even a plane, when they stumbled upon a cache of items hidden in a farmhouse.
The painting was discovered by chance by the Italian police in his mother's kitchen. So it had gone on a long journey.
Congregation leaving had spent several years gathering dust while rolled up and stored in a hidey hole between two walls. The drug lord had been trying to sell the painting for some time, but now facing charges of his own, he was only too happy to assist the authorities in finding the thief.
The thief of the painting, Octave Durham, believes that the picture is cursed. He relates this to the fact that the first contact he tried to sell it to was shot before he could take possession of it, and also perhaps to the fact that he himself did 3 years in prison for its theft. I have to feel that the curse is really the curse of stupidity. If you carry out a theft as impulsively and inefficiently as that, and then try to fence it in the underworld, you're likely to encounter a certain amount of trouble and tribulation.
Van Gogh's own life was fairly tragic, and one could argue that any of the works which he produced during these kind of tragic periods are somehow affected by that. But I think that the curse is more to do with the person who stole it and his own guilt about what he'd done.
I think this is a painting that seems to have developed an intimate acquaintance with death. You could look back to the fact that Van Gogh's father died while he was in the process of painting it, so that death, in a sense, is painted into the picture. On the other hand, you could also say that it has survived remarkably well. So if there's a curse, it certainly doesn't touch the painting itself, only those around it.
Cursed or not, it will be a brave art thief who dares to steal his work again. The next stop on our cursed treasure hunt are the eerie marshlands of the east of England, an unlikely resting place perhaps for a king, and the greatest archaeological discovery in the history of the British Isles.
In May 1939, 4 months before the outbreak of World War II, an amateur archaeologist began excavating a burial mound. What they unearthed gave a unique and unprecedented insight into life in 6th and 7th century England.
It's been a site of enormous influence for the history of England. The finds were extraordinarily beautiful. The craftsmanship is absolutely amazing, and the effect was stunning at the time.
Sutton Hoo is the only full Anglo-Saxon royal cemetery that's been discovered. And what's more, there's a great human story behind the discovery.
Like many of the world's most famous archaeological wonders, Sutton Hoo was a burial site, and there are plenty of people who still believe that interfering with the dead will only bring disaster. The first accounts of there being secrets beneath the ground near Woodbridge in Suffolk date back more than 400 years.
Round about 1600, somebody, persons unknown, came and dug holes in the top of most of these mounds.
They'd all been interfered with by ancient grave robbers. These are prominent mounds in a well-frequented place, and most of them have been cleaned out by robbers.
In 1862, there was another excavation. We picked this one up in the Ipswich Gazette, so it had happened then, and people who were digging thought they were digging Roman mounds, so they had a go at them. One of the mounds produced 2 bushels of iron screw bolts. But they didn't quite know what they were, so they took them away to the local blacksmith to be made into horseshoes.
The reason why the treasure was still there in the biggest mound is that it was slightly off-centre, and robbers had dug down halfway and then given up. And afterwards, everybody was deterred from digging by the fact the mound had been dug into before.
It wasn't until the years leading up to World War II that interest in investigating the contents of the mysterious mounds was renewed by the owner of the land.
The story of how the Sutton Hoo treasure was discovered is really the story of 2 remarkable individuals. One was a rich widow called Edith Pretty, who was an heiress. She had a fortune worth 32 million in present values. So she is in charge of this estate. She's got time on her hands, and she wants to have a look at the ancient burial mounds on her property.
Without the curiosity and financial means of Edith Pretty, the secrets of Sutton Hoo might never have been discovered. But there was already a dark shadow being cast over Sutton Hoo and its lady owner.
Edith Pretty had wanted since she was 18 to marry Mr. Pretty, but her father thought him beneath her, and she had to wait over 20 years in order to marry him till her father died. And then he died of cancer after only a few years, leaving her broken-hearted.
Maybe out of a feeling of being alone, she wanted to make contact with her husband, if that makes sense. You know, she had a medium in London she used to visit. He gave her a lot of comfort, it seems.
Edith firmly believed in spirits, and it was a spectral series of events that led her to want to investigate the burial mounds on her land.
Edith Pretty had a friend called Dorothy Cox, and every time she visited Edith, she had a vision of Anglo-Saxon soldiers marching round the ancient mounds at Sutton Hoo. Then there was a man called William Parish, who was another friend, who had a vision of a rider on a black horse in the same area around the mounds, and he suggested that Edith dig into them.
There's also a report of Edith and some friends holding a séance, at which an apparition appeared of a warrior on horseback. And he told her to plunge a sword into the burial mound.
It was this that pushed her over into the decision to excavate. The man whom Edith Pretty brings in to excavate the burial mounds is a local archaeologist, Basil Brown, comes from a farming family. He's a very experienced local archaeologist, has been doing a lot of excavating, connected to the local museum at Ipswich, and is a safe pair of hands.
Mrs. Pretty, the landowner, chose the mounds that were to be dug. The biggest one and a sort of long oval mound. It looked pretty juicy. And so Basil started digging there. He had Mrs. Pretty's gardener and gamekeeper as his assistants. So the three of them merrily went off with their wheelbarrow and started trenching through the mound. Very much a traditional way of doing things.
Digging much deeper than the grave robbers who had looted the other mounds, it wasn't long before Basil Brown came upon something unremarkable, but that would lead him to the treasure.
The first artifact that was discovered was actually an iron bolt. And happily, Basil Brown recognized it as being the kind of bolt that holds together the planks of a wooden ship. So he got his team to follow down the heads of these bolts, and they made a pattern which was the pattern of a ship that was in a trench. And it wasn't until they got to the middle of that they saw the dark patch of the burial chamber, and that's where all the great finds came from.
The marauders who had plundered the other burial chambers had missed the prize. This wasn't the tomb of a commoner, but the resting place of a great warrior king.
Pretty well everything we associate with Anglo-Saxon royalty has come out of Sutton Hoo. There's a lot of armour, especially the iconic helmet, which appears on one book cover after another. There are fittings of gold set with garnets. There are metal bowls from the other end of the Mediterranean.
So all the objects were really squashed and fragmented. Hardly anything was actually complete. The helmet, that was found in over 100 little sherds of iron, and it given us an iconic helmet, which I think everybody in the world knows.
News quickly spread of there being treasure in the Suffolk countryside, and rumours of ghosts or even a curse weren't going to be enough to protect the royal loot.
Sutton Hoo, once discovered, had to be kept quiet for quite a long time because of the risk that people would loot it.
They did have a policeman on duty while the excavation was going on in 1939. But the word got out, and light aircraft were seen to be skimming over the top and have a look down so that the press photographers could take a shot or two. A lot of publicity, even though it's on the eve of World War II.
The treasure ended up in the London subway system to protect it from the bombing, and then left for years before they were properly studied and reassembled.
So the British Museum, under Rupert Bruce Mitford, set about putting all these objects back together again. Extraordinarily skillful piece of work.
Once in the conservative hands of the British Museum, one may have assumed that any curse or misfortune associated with Sutton Hoo may have come to an end. But death and discontent were never far away.
You can make a case that some bad luck attended Sutton Hoo. Edith Pretty lived long enough to see the site properly excavated, but died of a stroke just 3 years later. There was a certain amount of difficulty over the excavation because it turned out to be too big and important to be left to a local archaeologist. And the guy who got the job was Charles Phillips, who was a Cambridge academic.
Having made the discovery, Basil Brown was ordered to leave the site by Charles Phillips. Brown was understandably wounded by the slight. Indeed, it has been said that Basil Brown carried his disappointment right up to his death in 1977.
Basil Brown felt discredited and slighted, and then Charles Phillips fell out with Basil Brown's employers, the Ipswich Museum, in big time.
Terrified that the incredible site would be looted by thieves, Phillips was incensed when the Ipswich Museum announced the discovery without his permission, and much earlier than intended.
The question is treasure kind of bad for people? It is true that in the days of early Christianity in particular, they were quite worried about it. And when excavations took place, a priest was on hand to exorcise any devils that might pop out.
I don't buy into the idea of curses over ancient monuments and sites myself. I'd be pretty scared in my profession if I did. Basil Brown feeling sidelined, the quarrelling between Phillips and the museum, and Edith Pretty dying soon after. All of these are within the realm of normal coincidence.
But what of the ghosts and apparitions that visited Edith and her friends?
Well, I don't personally believe in ghosts, but I do believe that people often see things that aren't really there. Not usually as spectacular as a phantom warrior, but the power of suggestion is often underestimated.
Archaeology isn't interfering with the dead. What it's doing is giving the dead a voice.
Whatever the truth about ghosts and curses at Sutton Hoo, no one can deny the incredible historical importance of the finds and the role of Edith Pretty in their discovery.
Edith Pretty lived long enough to see everything that had come out of the site literally laid out on her table at home initially. And then she gifted the entire collection to the nation. By law, it was actually hers, and Winston Churchill offered to decorate her for her generosity, and she refused that as well.
Research that's been done has hugely expanded the significance of Sutton Hoo in that it now tells the story of the birth of an English kingdom.
Since World War II, there have been further digs at Sutton Hoo, which have served to further highlight the site's dark and macabre history, one that spans centuries.
We found a cemetery of people who'd been hanged on gallows. And these people had been dumped into graves rather unceremoniously, and this was carbon dated to the 8th, 10th century.
The 1980s excavations and the discovery of more bodies at Sutton Hoo have ensured that rumours of dangerous spirits and bad fortune persist. It is said that soldiers are still patrolling the corridors of the British Museum, guarding the King's treasure.
Is there really any truth or any fact that supernatural forces were at work? Edith May Pretty's death, well, 59 isn't that unusual. And Basil Brown, there's no evidence that he was cursed or suffered misfortune.
Beware of disturbing the grave of a king, for it may not just be buried treasure you reveal, but the spirits of those charged with protecting him in this world and the next. Our next tale of cursed treasure is not a story of gold and silver. It is one of knowledge and power. We travel to the northern shores of the Dead Sea and back to a time when many of the cornerstones of society as we know it were first being laid.
Few archaeological finds have been as important or as controversial as the Dead Sea Scrolls.
There is a mystique about the scrolls, a sense of mystery.
Ownership has been fought over by Arabs, by Jews, by Palestinians.
This forgotten archive contains secrets lost over time through the writing and rewriting of our often dark history.
They are ancient manuscripts, 2,000 years old.
They're one of the earliest accounts of the Hebrew Bible.
There are some 800 to 1,000 Dead Sea Scrolls.
There's over 11,000 pieces of parchment and other materials.
The curse of the discovery of pottery, parchment, and ink fueled the fires of greed, mistrust, and control on a global level.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered by a goat herder in 1947 in Qumran, which is on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, on the West Bank.
It was discovered by 3 Bedouin. They were throwing rocks into the caves, looking for their lost goat. And they heard the sound of the breaking of pottery. The first person who entered the cave was somebody called Mohammed Ed-Dib, or the Wolf.
He found a series of ceramic jars, and inside were animal skin parchments that were wrapped in linen.
These articles have been hidden, and they clearly were hidden in caves for their own protection, maybe to stop the Romans and other people getting it.
Some of them could not be unwrapped physically, some of them were charred, and some of them were just falling into pieces.
The goat herders informed the local archaeologists.
When academics and scholars became aware of this, in the next 10 years, a total of around 850 scrolls were discovered across 11 different cave sites.
As yet unaware of the importance of what had been found, they set about gathering the documents.
They were initially brought to Bethlehem, and perhaps not surprisingly, a number of experts, both in Jerusalem and further afield, didn't recognize the antiquity, the old age of these scrolls.
And they ended up with the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem.
It was only here, nearly a year after their initial discovery, that the importance of the scrolls was uncovered and understood.
When the scrolls were brought to their attention, John C. Trevor was the one who fielded the inquiry.
He was able to take some excellent early photographs of those scrolls and sent them to a very eminent scholar called Albright. Albright immediately wrote back to say, this is the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century.
In the decades that have passed since the discovery of those first few scrolls, many experts have come to agree on who most likely created the library.
They were created by a Jewish sect called the Essenes. There have been discoveries of skeletons, human remains, and they've done analysis which really substantiates this theory.
This is the ancient equivalent of a very elite group that was able to, fatten up animals in a time of very low resources for most people, to write down their community rules in several copies, and also display a lot of knowledge from across the Hellenistic world.
They were recording history and then wanting to protect history, to hand it down from generation to generation.
Some of the ideas that they shared have had a global reach. Things like astrology, horoscopes.
What the scrolls describe of the Essenes' life is the most revealing evidence of the development of religion in the times before Jesus' birth and at the time at which he was alive.
It was the cultural and religious significance of these scrolls that was to cast a dark shadow over their discovery. For whoever possessed them could control them and the knowledge contained within.
There will always be mystery and controversy about the scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls have been called one of the biggest academic scandals of the 20th century.
The so-called Battle of the Scrolls. This was a battle between those who had access to the scrolls and those who did not.
For 4 decades, they were kept in conditions of extreme secrecy.
The scrolls came under a monopoly of scholars.
They were all men and didn't include any Jewish scholars. Perhaps an element of vanity that they knew if they kept everything, then they would become famous.
They weren't shared with other experts in the field worldwide, and this was very unusual for such a highly important set of documents.
But while scholars worked behind closed doors, new additions to the collection had been filtering in over the years from sites spread around the Dead Sea area. And as the mystery surrounding them grew, along with their value, they attracted the attention of the criminal underworld.
Segments and fragments of the scrolls started to appear on the black market. Even the Wall Street Journal had 4 scrolls for sale in 1954. Since 2002, there have been about 70 different fragments that have gone up for sale. Some of them have sold for millions, but it's estimated that around 90% of them are forged.
Anything that valuable, unfortunately nowadays, will eventually attract the attention of organized crime groups.
Sometimes collectors can be so obsessed with having obtained an object, they don't ask questions about where it came from, who owns it, or anything else. They just want to have it.
Such was the desire to possess these treasures that even respectable institutions were making desperate attempts to acquire them. The astronomical prices these treasures were valued at saw a rise in sales on the black market and the production of forgeries.
In 2020, it was discovered that all of the fragments being held by the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. were all forgeries. And they had them in these highly temperature-controlled, high security boxes, that people and tourists would come to view. And in the end, what they were viewing were fakes.
Disputes over the ownership of the Dead Sea Scrolls continues to this day. The nations of Jordan and Palestine both lay claim to them, but they are currently in the possession of the Israel Museum. However, the political pressure to share their contents with the world finally won through.
In 1991, those who wanted access won, and the Israel Antiquities Authority opened up all the scrolls to everyone.
What scientists have done is actually digitally unwrap and piece together some of these scrolls.
Probably the most spectacular ones would be the digital Dead Sea Scrolls that was done by Google and the Israel Museum. Anybody can look at them, and they're incredible images of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
While work continues to restore their contents, the condition of many of the scrolls means that they will never be able to be read. Those that have been deciphered continue to enlighten us about the lives of those who wrote them and the methods they used to protect their history.
The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a number of curses. They're a form of protection against evil beings.
The people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly believed in the effectiveness of curses and blessings.
These ancient lands of the West Bank that we call the Holy Land has been steeped in bloodshed ever since. In that sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the product of a cursed land. And you could look at it and say it's little wonder, therefore, that the scrolls themselves always seem to trail unhappiness and controversy in their wake.
One thing is certain: knowledge is power. And thousands of years after they were written, the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to exert great force over scholars who seek to understand the mysteries that lie within their faded parchments.